Welcome back. I hope you're having a brilliant day, and we're here to make it a little bit better because I have for you an esteemed guest, someone who started the FPL season well, and we can learn a lot from. I've got FPL Fran. So, how are you, mate?
Doing good. I wouldn't say I'm necessarily doing great in terms of the start of the season, but looking forward to be here.
Well, it's a pleasure to have you on. Today, what we'll be covering is the main talking points from the season so far, including specific plays, which a lot of people have dilemmas about. Then we'll be looking at Wildcard 4 and Wildcard 6. So a lot of strategy and a lot of analysis when it comes to players, teams, and styles today. So let's hop straight into it. We're going to start with a player that you own and you went from the start with, someone who's more popular in the analytics community, Bruno Fernandes. You'll obviously be holding him for Southampton, but after, what are your thoughts with him? I know quite a few people own him, and at the moment, it looks like the way Ten Hag's system has platformed him has been quite poor in FPL in terms of the fact that he has to help with build up at times because against deeper, more complex blocks, it's been pretty difficult for United. They've had their struggles in those areas. At times, he's playing false nine, but he's not really getting the ball much because of United's creativity issues. So, what's your plan with him, even if he was to haul after Southampton?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I think I started the season discussing this with you, where I feel like even at this sort of price point, that Bruno isn't that much of a problem if he's playing deep at times. I feel what's nice is compared to last season, we're seeing him a lot more advanced at times. But clearly he hasn't taken his opportunity. So I think if we just look at some of the data so far, it's not that he's like one of the leading performers, but certainly if you look at biggest underperformers of sort of their expected data, and Bruno is absolutely top of the list by far. Not to the extent really where, you know, I wouldn't be comfortable saying Bruno is something like a really poor finisher or anything like that. We've talked about how his teammates have let him down in the past, but generally speaking, you know, he's been unfortunate, and part of that could be his fault, just in terms of, as it turns out, the last 3 games, he's been pretty poor in terms of converting. And the Liverpool game, I think he was completely shut out. That was the worst game from Bruno, probably the worst game from United. But I think when I look at this run, it was the game that it was always going to be bad, and unfortunately he just hasn't delivered in game weeks 1 and 2. So because you've mentioned Southampton, I'm very comfortable keeping him there. I think he's one of those picks where if I have bigger fish to fry, so in previous weeks I've had issues like Nkunku, I've had issues like, you know, Kwanzaa in my team, I've dealt with those players very quickly. In this week, I don't necessarily still see Bruno as a sell just yet, even after Southampton, even if he does well there, mostly because I think, you know, he still has all the tools that I previously thought make him a good FPL asset, and nothing really has changed. Whereas with some of the other players I've mentioned, you know, there's larger issues, and I'd like to start rolling finally. So I feel like maybe if I was in a bit more of a luxurious situation, like let's say I had 2 free transfers, I'd probably consider, you know, pivoting away from Bruno, but nothing has made me extremely concerned so far, because I think I've played FPL long enough to know that someone who actually has good underlying data is still going to return eventually.
Yeah, fair. Do you think one thing you mentioned was that he's playing even more advanced this year? Do you think that's actually a good thing for him? Would you not prefer him maybe in like as a 10 as opposed to a false 9, where a lot of the pitch is in front of him when he receives the ball, as opposed to back to goal and trying to manufacture something from there, whether it be from the high press or just Casemiro slotting him in as he has done with his quite direct passing?
Yeah, it's a good point. I think in the past we've enjoyed like Bruno, the quarterback, as well, you know, pinging a long ball to someone like Rashford. Ultimately, I think we've seen like false 9 Bruno under like Solskjaer, for example. It's worked out well. I think he can play comfortably in many different positions on the pitch, and I think the beauty of Bruno, even though he's shown none of it so far, is that he can be productive despite where he plays. Just looking at the last few seasons of data, like we can say how bad United have been. Even start of this season, I think they've looked relatively poor, but his underlying data still looks very, very strong, which means that for me, he's still a good FPL asset.
Well, I think that is certainly a fair analysis. Let's move on to one of the biggest talking points of Game Week 4, and that is selling Bukayo Saka and Alexander Isak, and using 2 free transfers, or maybe even a hit in some cases, for Mohamed Salah and Joao Pedro. Now, really, you'd only be doing this for a hit if you are super bullish on Salah and very pessimistic with regards to Saka and Isak. How do you see this move just in general, but specifically with 2 free transfers and those 4 players individually? How do you see Saka in Game Week 5, which I certainly have a different perspective on to most, so we can talk about that. Do you think Newcastle get better? And how do you think Salah does?
Yeah, I think let's just start with Newcastle. They've looked awful recently, and there's a lot of issues. Like in terms of build-up, you could watch the Tottenham game, and it's not often that I overreact to teams, because we've seen a very strong Newcastle attack in the last 2 seasons, but we've seen some things dip, right? The defense definitely dropped off in the previous season compared to the one before that. And this season, they haven't even played well at home, which was something where when I've been looking at the data for the last 2 years, they're clearly the biggest overperformers at home. They probably put an awful performance versus Tottenham. And that's not a good sign. But then I also have to say the fixtures are still there in the immediate term. So for the next 2 weeks, Isak has 2 good fixtures. But then you're asking me the question of using 2 free transfers to go from Saka and Isak to Salah and Joao Pedro. And actually, I think it's a perfect move, because Joao Pedro ultimately has amazing fixtures, better fixtures than Isak ultimately. And so, for the price point difference, I think it's worth it. And then obviously, I still feel exactly the same about Saka and Salah, especially since Salah is a captaincy option in Game Week 5. So whenever I think about the upside of going from Saka to Salah, you have to sort of consider, Salah almost effectively doubled versus the next best captain on Game Week 5 as well. And I think there's also another gulf of sort of advantage that you can get from just making these 2 moves. For a hit, I'd have to say I'm not too high on it, because unfortunately, the issue with making these 2 moves is you're probably looking at something very similar in 2 weeks' time, where you're thinking about going from Salah and Joao Pedro, or someone at the price point of Joao Pedro, if you have that, back into Saka plus Havertz, right? And I think that's the tricky thing. If your team really has no issues and you can do 2 free transfers, this makes a lot of sense. But you also have to consider how quickly you want to go back into Saka and how quickly you want to go back into someone like Havertz at the price point of Isak.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I think one thing I'm going to double down with you is Joao Pedro. I think not only is the Ipswich at home fixture very good for him, I don't like the Forest fixture too much because I rate the defense, and that's something I'm going to come on to. But after that, he has a string of games which are against, I'd say, the better sides in the league. But I actually think he's going to be fine, not just because of his expected minutes and penalties. But I've been very impressed with Hertzler so far, the balance he's brought to that side, but still managing to reinstate the attacking philosophy that De Zerbi did. And I think Brighton could do very well, create a lot of chances against good teams. And I wouldn't be surprised if at 5-5 he becomes the best budget pick we just have in this game. So I completely agree. Moving on to Bukayo Saka. I do think that City Arsenal in Game Week 5 will be a little bit more open than it was last year. Last year was an extremely cagey affair, but I think with City taking it up a notch a bit in terms of their attack, and Arsenal not really having too many defensive solutions, given they have to play Partey at 6 currently with Rice left centre mid, I do think that City could get at him a little bit more and just makes for a bit more of an open game. So I wouldn't be super pessimistic on Salah for those who are. Moving on to Cole Palmer, let's look at it in 2 ways, micro and macro level. What are your output projections for him in this new Maresca system? And how do you compare him to the other premiums? And not just those, but also Brian Mbeumo, Eberechi Eze, the likes of whom at 7 million also are talismanic in nature, have penalties, have decent fixtures, etc., etc.
Yeah, I guess one way I could answer the question is, I'm not sure if he has to go against, like, let's say, Mbeumo and Eze. But obviously, if you own Palmer in the team, presumably you own someone like Haaland and Salah, and obviously the price and the budget is just really tight. So let's say if you go for Mbeumo and Eze in the midfield, it probably means that you have no budget midfielders. You're looking at, dismissing Rodgers, dismissing some of the other options, and then actually maybe even dismissing someone like Havertz up top because of how much money you're spending on these types of picks. I do really like these types of picks, though, especially going back to Cole Palmer, just him and himself in isolation. I still think when we look at Chelsea, I'm not really sure there's going to be a significant drop-off on attack compared to Poch, and I think that was something that looked really good at the end of the season. And what we saw at the end of the season last year, too, was Cole Palmer at the 10, which I do think that's his best position. And I'm quite worried, obviously, if someone doesn't own Cole Palmer. I think he's absolutely brilliant in a bit of a freer role. As long as he sort of plays in that position, I feel he's always just going to be constantly an amazing pick. But even at right wing, we've seen that, he's got access to set pieces as well. Generally speaking, his production is very good across the board. I've looked at the underlying data in terms of like how he plays right wing last season compared to 10. I still think, yes, of course, when you're translating to another system, there's going to be some differences, but I can't really see why Cole Palmer will be anything less than what we really think of him. So my answer to that is just, it really depends on, whether you're willing to drop some of the budget from your forward line, maybe your defense, because I think all of them are great options. And for Mbeumo and Eze, I have to say Mbeumo is not someone I'm looking at until Game Week 6. So, when we talk about fixture swings and things like that, and you want to be moving out of players in the midfield, I mean, there's always an option to do that. Whereas Cole Palmer and Eze still look really good for the next two game weeks.
Do you not see Mbeumo in 5? I know it's Spurs away, but Spurs are always a side that you can get at, and he'll certainly be the player to get at them, as opposed to, I guess, other players. Mainly Shada on the left. Should Thomas Frank play him? But do you not think he could definitely get something there?
I mean, it's. I probably feel that I'm a little bit higher on Tottenham than I was last season on defense. Obviously Van de Ven is out. I think hopefully he'll recover during the international break, so that's quite significant. Dragusin didn't look too bad, to be honest, versus Newcastle himself. But yeah, I think generally I'm a little bit more optimistic looking at some of the underlying data so far from Spurs. Obviously very small sample size, but then it's also the context of they have their full team back. Are we a bit more generally confident in their defense with that? And then also ultimately, as I said, I'm always looking into home and away. And for me, whenever you're playing away, it's really not ideal for me. So I do take a lot of comfort into that. I know Haaland just scored a hat-trick away from home versus West Ham, by the way, but
he's different.
He is different. And ultimately, I still stand by sort of decisions like that and making not just looking at purely the fixture, but then also just whether it's home and away.
All right, perfect. Let's move on to talking points part 2. So someone we've touched on already, and someone that I think is really interesting, specifically because I'm looking at bringing him in this week, is Eberechi Eze. Now, I think there are a few things here. One, I'm becoming increasingly aware and placing increasing importance on players who play in close proximity to goal. So not just your number 9s, but also the guys who play 10 as opposed to wingers, because a lot of the wingers nowadays aren't ones who will constantly penetrate the half spaces like you saw under Jurgen Klopp, but they'll hold width a lot. For example, an iron system, a Pep system, a variety of systems, right? Whereas Eze, playing in a system which is a back 3, is constantly in that left half space. He's playing just behind the striker at times, and he dominates that zone. There's no one else who really enters it and crowds it for him. And I think that's great with his quality. The best example being his goal against Chelsea, right? I mean, he took that so well because he's in that position in the first place. His fixtures, I would say, are a mixed bag, and we can definitely interpret them in a different way. But what I would say I haven't liked is Palace's performances so far. Sure, he got a 10-pointer against Chelsea, but he was pretty quiet compared to what you would have liked. And I thought Chelsea did a good job defensively overall in the game. He didn't do too much against West Ham. Yeah, he was very good against Brentford, but that was the first game of the season, and I don't think Brentford's defensive performance was great that day. So I was just wondering, where do you stand on him? Do you think he's essential and still the most unbelievable value at 6.9?
I probably would step and say he's essential, but I think he's a player that's close to it, because I think at that price point there aren't many players in the game who offers what he does. Once again, at the end of the day, he's a penalty taker. He takes a lot of set pieces. So in terms of ability to rack up bonus, that's all there. We know he takes a lot of shots on target, and I think going back to your point about people who occupy key spaces, even if you look at last season, he's one of the few players who just spams shots more so than any other midfielder, even more so than someone like Palmer. And so I think because he actually has that license within a slightly weaker team, it's also a bit of a benefit, because when people talk about talismans, I think when you go and look at bigger and better teams, you tend to see some of the shares for key players drop in terms of, let's say, assist share, goal share. I know Haaland's a different case, so we won't really mention him, but the reality is there's a lot of sharing there being done, and with Crystal Palace the concentration is all in Eze. Now that makes it maybe a little bit easier in theory to defend him, but I just think that when you have that many tools, you're still going to be a good pick. And yeah, even though fixtures aren't particularly good, particularly I think Game Week 7 is a pretty bad one, he is still someone where, because he's in my team, I have no reason at all to sell someone like this, because I just don't think anyone at 7 million actually offers that value. Or 6.9.
Yeah, no, I think that's completely fair. And having a price drop is pretty nice for non-owners like me who are looking to bring him in.
True.
Fulham are a team that people have been quite hot on in FPL. Not just Muniz and ESR, but also Robinson, who's been not a revelation, but he's been very, very useful for owners such as myself. Where do you stand on these two guys who are quite popular? People are looking at taking them out already. For me, I see Muniz as someone who's accumulated a lot of chances and just fundamentally a very good footballer. So I do think he's going to catch up to his delta within the statistics. And then ESR, I think, is a slightly more difficult conundrum. So where do you stand on that? Do you think they're going to be somewhat of the Newcastle of old, where they're significantly better at home? That is a pattern that we could potentially see emerge.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head with Smith Rowe and sort of questioning it, because I think you've got to look so far. He kind of looks like he's clocking what Andreas did last season, which was like that sort of 70-minute range substitute. And yes, of course, he's going to have the international break now, but I don't suddenly see him becoming an immediate 90-minute player. I don't think that's necessarily what Marco Silva expects. And part of it is not just, okay, how key of a player you are, but I think he does demand physical output, and Fulham are a team that do exert a lot of that energy. So someone like Iwobi, I'd probably think that I'm more confident that he's going to clock more 90s over the course of the season than someone like Smith Rowe, even disregarding like the match fitness element of things. So I think the interesting thing with Smith Rowe is obviously we haven't seen him play football very much for the last 2 years. So how comfortable can you be in the first 3 games of data? And then obviously, even in some of the historical data and how that translates. I think so far, because he's played so few minutes, I don't really love the Smith Rowe pick right now. I know a lot of people have transferred into him. I personally saw it quite similar to you, where when you look at Eze, Leicester at home is a prime fixture. And so, okay, he's done well in that game, but then going forwards, is he still a buy? I don't necessarily think so. With Muniz, it's an interesting one because I think his minutes have stayed constant. We knew he was going to be a 75-minute player, and that sub for Jimenez is coming in, but nothing has changed there. And actually, his XG has been extremely consistent, like you said. So I think he's racking like something like 0.4 XG per game. Obviously, these were nicer fixtures, but you also have to add in the context that they still have a decent run still. Do I see him as a buy, though? No. But do I see Muniz as a hold? Absolutely. I think unless you want to move into Joao Pedro, and that's a luxury transfer for you, then that's the play. But otherwise, I'm not looking into investing Fulham anytime soon, but I probably wouldn't go cold on even Smith Rowe ultimately, because you might as well see out those games. If you can make a double transfer, like we said, where, for example, you saw a really powerful move just now with the Isak plus Saka move. If you can do that with Smith Rowe, fine. But ultimately, I think a lot of the midfield targets that we all like outside of Eze are probably a few weeks away from us. Like Mbumo, we probably want to revisit. As you said, maybe on 5, but probably on 6.
Yeah, no, I think that's very, very fair. And I share the same sentiment. That's what I was really getting at with Muniz, that I think he is a hold and not so much a sell. Like you said, maybe it's a luxury if you're really not bullish on him, but I think he'll catch up. We'll leave the big one till last. I'm not a particular big fan of bringing in Nicholas Jackson. I don't like the fact that when you bring assets in, I think they should always be able to realistically haul, especially at 7.5 million plus. I just don't see his finishing consistency establishing itself anytime soon. And therefore, especially with the spread of output in that Chelsea team, yes, he's denying, but he'll still be there. And he's only going to do himself damage on the bonus point system, I think, when he misses big chances. What do you think of someone who's gaining a lot of traction in Nicholas Jackson?
I think the reason why he's got traction right now is because he's obviously been extremely hot, right? Like he's already scored 2 goals, has 1 assist. So, I mean, the issue for me is actually under Poch, he was a 90-minute player. Right now under Maresca, he's something between 65 and maybe 80. So you're looking at an average of, something in the 70s. And I feel that is not how FPL intended to price him, if I'm being honest. I feel like they probably looked at last season, his minutes last season, tried to project ahead to what Jackson would be like if he was going to play under a similar sort of performing team. And the reality is playing a lot less minutes than I'd actually like to have. I think in terms of shots on target, it's an interesting one because I did look into someone like Darwin, right, who we classically associate as a pretty poor finisher. Jackson and Darwin both finished under their XG last season. But the interesting thing is that I think it doesn't impact the bonus too much in terms of like if you're poor on missing big chances definitely do impact bonus. But I would say the shots on target change was probably more of a net benefit for Jackson anyways. He was always going to miss like big chances in the past, and he still will in the future. I think ultimately he's a bit of a questionable buy because going back to players like Mbumo and Eze, you're going to get the full amount of minutes from them. They have tools like penalties. They might not have the underlying stats of someone like Jackson per 90, but the reality is right now Jackson doesn't look like a 90-minute player, and that's probably my biggest source of concern. I wouldn't say he's a trap, but I think he definitely feels like one of those buys where you already have a lot of money hold up in the forward position and you don't want to like necessarily just downgrade, right? Maybe you already have Joao Pedro in the team. You're someone who's been holding Solanke, or let's say, I don't know, if you are pretty cold on someone like Isak or Watkins, fair enough. But yeah, it's not someone where I'd break my team around and suddenly get Jackson in it. I feel like we've got enough budget forwards where you can kind of bypass Jackson.
It's interesting because we would definitely be speaking about Dominic Solanke later.
Mm-hmm.
And then let's move to the big one. If I had to push you, and then you can discuss it, Haaland and Salah, one of them or neither, which I doubt it's neither.
I think from a Game Week 4 perspective, because we're going to talk about Wildcard, I'd say Haaland and Salah's nice, like the combination.
Let's talk about from not just for Game Week 4, but let's say for the next, let's say 8 weeks, if you're building a team here.
That's the thing. So, I mean, what I mean is, if I was to wildcard in Game Week 4, I think I'd probably have both. If you asked me if you asked me the same question probably next week, I'd probably just go on one or the other. Probably I'd go on Haaland, because I think, generally speaking, once again, if I had to pick someone to captain for the rest of my season, would I be more comfortable with Haaland? I probably would. So I'm there, but I think one of the tricky things of this game week in specific and the next, if you add the two, is that they just both have a good run of games, and Haaland obviously has a poor one versus Arsenal, but then you ultimately are going to benefit a lot more from owning Salah over any sort of 10-point X mid over the next 2 weeks. So he's quite important to me from a captaincy sense. And I feel like this is the season where you're allowed to move between premiums. So while some people are now moving into Salah, which I think is still fine because there's 2 good game weeks, but in reality, if you own Salah, or if I own Salah right now, I'd still plan actually a transfer towards Saka in 2 weeks' time. That's just how I'm thinking as an FPL manager. I'm not looking at the fact that he's scored 13.67 points per game and that he's going to continue this sort of ridiculous hot streak. And the same goes for Haaland, even though I still think he looks a touch better than last season. And probably that's a small exaggeration because he's actually looking a lot better.
He looks unreal.
So that's sort of my thoughts on it. I think generally speaking, I still have that comfort with Haaland overall. But yeah, if I was to actually wildcard this week, I'd have both.
With Game Week 5, I completely agree. I think Salah definitely is the best captaincy option. I would say 2 things. So I do think that, like I said earlier, that Arsenal isn't as bad of a fixture for Haaland as it was last year. So his, I guess, rating for Game Week 5 goes up. I also do think in Game Week 4, Forest still aren't being given the credit that they deserve. I think defensively this year, they've been pretty good. They were pretty decent towards the back end of last year under Nuno as well. It's just that the goalkeeping let them down a lot in terms of clean sheets. But this year, I think it's at least gotten to a level whereby that's not really happening. So I've been quite impressed by them. For me, it's Game Week 5 that I'd really like Salah. But for 4, as a non-owner, I'm not too worried.
Yeah, I think that's fair. And part of it too is because, I mean, if you look at it from like a Saka point of view, the gulf between Saka Game Week 4 isn't as big as the gulf between him and Salah in Game Week 5. But yeah, I mean, captaincy is a huge element of the game. We saw how swingy it was last week. I feel like some people on a Salah-only team might have actually gone for Saka or Palmer as a captain, whereas people on a Haaland team went for Haaland as a captain. And the reality is all these assets are really good because we've seen like someone like Saka, I think he was the king of Game Week 1, right? And it's hard to always get the call right when ultimately these players are that good.
Yeah, for sure. So here we have a Game Week 4 wildcard draft, which Fran has built, and I have built the one for Game Week 6, which he has not yet seen. And as you can see, this is on the Fantasy Football Hub My Team AI tool. If you would like to get 50% off, the offer has extended. You can do so with the link in the description. I mean, for £3.25 a month, it is fantastic value for money. Some of the best in the world revealing their team to you each and every week is pretty much a cheat code to getting a good rank in this game. The likes of Ben Crellin, Rich Clark, this magnificent tool, and so much more. So do check it out. Link is in the description, and you will get 50% off and money back if you don't win your mini league. So for this wildcard 4 draft, and just in general with the strategy, the floor is all yours. Run me through your team, and then I'll certainly question you a little bit more when we get to wildcard 6.
Yeah, I mean, what I've tried to do is create a little bit of a balance between the need to get Arsenal assets in Game Week 6 and then also ultimately respecting the fact they've got 2 tough fixtures next. In the goalkeeping position, I think a lot of people have gravitated towards Raya, but I have to be honest, if Verbruggen is a starter, I think Fleck and Verbruggen is just an insane rotation. So you can already see, you know, even the next 3 game weeks here within the sort of wild card, you have Verbruggen for the next 2 weeks, 2 amazing fixtures, Ipswich at home, Nottingham Forest at home, and then you switch back to someone like Flecken, who actually rotates really well with him, with West Ham at home there. And then when it comes to Lewis, so the defense actually has Robertson, Lewis, Munoz, Konsa, Emerson. This shows, you know, negative 0.1 in the bank, but I think that's just looking at your in the bank value. I'd probably be happy to drop Emerson to someone like Mosquera if you don't have the cash. I think that's a very simple move to do. The reason why I like Munoz is because I think he's quite close to a price drop. So maybe at 4.9, he's actually a big steal for a lot of managers. With Lewis, it's quite debatable. I think you can look at Man City this season and say that he looks essential for now, but that for now is a huge quotation mark because that can go out of the room very quickly, particularly if, let's say, when I look at the system right now, I'm not really sure where Foden fits in. A lot of people are just going to say Foden will replace Lewis, but by replacing Lewis, you are replacing the system. And I think that's a small issue that I have. I do think Foden's very important to Man City, but I also think that Pep is the type of manager who, when he likes something that's working and he's very happy with the players' performances, until they really get injured, I think Lewis is more than likely going to play games. The big question mark, of course, is going to be whether he plays games like Arsenal at home, because that's going to be a very physical game. I think we talk about teams like West Ham and Brentford and we say that they're physical, but the reality is I think the test versus Arsenal is completely different. So then I would be interested in actually knowing whether Lewis plays. But then I also feel like if you're wildcarding Game Week 4 and you're looking at Lewis, having played the last few weeks, having played really well, and then looking at how Man City just generally play this season, he still feels like someone you might want to take the risk on, which is why I kind of like having Emerson as a bit of depth, just in case the Lewis punt doesn't work. Robertson is someone I've gone with here because I'm just really comfortable in Liverpool defense. They look really good this season. And I still think there is value there in just going for Robertson than trying to break your draft apart to go for someone like Trent, because look, we've taken a lot of price drops, all of us. If you're rich, you probably wildcarded. And so if you're poor like me, you probably need to go for someone like Robertson. And yes, of course, Trent looks incredible. The underlying stats are great, but I still think Robertson's good value for money. In the midfield, I've got Salah as a Rodgers, Minte, and Mbumo. The purpose of Minte and players like Rodgers, I think, is that you can kind of afford to bench someone like Mbumo specifically for Game Week 4. You can revisit that on Game Week 5. And ultimately, it's also, you have a bit more depth now to accommodate the somewhat weaker front line that I have, which is Havertz for the next 2 weeks. As I said, slightly poor fixtures, but then Haaland and Joao Pedro, who are just incredible picks going forwards. So I think the issue with this draft potentially is just the fact that I have Havertz and Mbumo, and maybe they're not the two strongest players, but I'm trying to set this wildcard up so that you don't book too many transfers in Game Week 6. And prospectively, what you can do is when Minte, let's say in Game Week 6 has a pretty poor fixture, you have options like maybe moving into someone like Odegaard or back into some of the other midfielders in the game at that 7.x price point, like maybe a Jared Bowen, and then sort of reconsidering that with the money that you might have when you move Salah to Saka.
So many interesting things there that I would love to talk about. Let's start with at the back. I completely agree. I think the Flecken Verbruggen rotation is fantastic. You made some very interesting points about Manchester City. I think that games like even Brentford in Game Week 4, I think Lewis is going to start because I doubt they play Sharda, so I doubt you need Walker's recovery place to compete with that. And Lewis has a skill set that I would say that no one else has got. I think Pep talked about how he can find space on the pitch in a way that is just so intelligent and so unique, right? And if you look at his role, it's very much appearing in little pockets and functioning in there. And there's not a lot of players nowadays who are excellent in those small spaces, essentially as football shifts. And not only is he good in the small spaces from deep areas where a traditional defender would be, but you see him getting into really advanced areas and performing very competently there. The only things being the fact that he hits the bar against Ipswich and blast one over against West Ham. But really, the fact that he hasn't got a goal yet, I think is very lucky for non-owners like myself. So I can completely agree. Where I agree even more is, as someone who's not the biggest Foden fan, I don't know where he gets into the side, because I think when De Bruyne is fit, it's very difficult to argue that Foden is a better 10 than De Bruyne. I definitely think De Bruyne is the better 10. And not only that, I think he's better for Haaland as more of a passer, as opposed to a range shooter and a carrier. And also he's a bit more versatile in the sense that if you want him to go from the right into the left spaces, he's fine. He can interchange with the Grealish, overlap, etc., right? You get more fluidity in the side. And then even on the right, I think Savio is someone against a low block who, for his skill set, could be absolute gold dust. So I do wonder where Foden gets into this side. And if he is at right wing, what's his minutes like, and do you really want him? I completely agree with you again on Robertson. I think I was really impressed by Arne Slot, how narrow that he's made his structure compared to Klopp. Very difficult to exploit on transition, especially through central areas. And the fact that Robertson's not just overlapping, but also underlapping when Diaz goes wide. So those two things in particular, I really like about this defense, having Robertson and Lewis. Obviously, you mentioned the expected minutes, but I think as long as you have depth in your defense like you do, benching Lewis is fine because you get so much upside at 4-6 and high clean sheet potential. So those two things in particular I really like. The third thing that I would question a little bit is I actually don't think that Havertz in 4 and 5 is too bad, because I think he's a striker built for these big games, given the fact he's 6'4", he's got good pace in the behind. I mean, he's super strong. He can dominate a zone. So I actually could see him being quite lucrative across 4 and 5. I wouldn't be surprised to see him get a haul. It's mainly for me just if he can get in his finishing hot streak. And then the rest I pretty much agree with. I like the Brighton double up to target it because, like I said, I think they'll do well against not just the smaller teams, but also the bigger teams as well. Right. Okay. And now we have a wildcard 6 draft that I've built for Fran. Now, this is the strategy that he's considering. So I thought I would give him a little something that he's probably not expecting. You've got Mascara that he's talked about, and it probably makes the draft look a little bit too Wolvesy. My thinking is that they actually have quite nice fixtures in the long run, and you bench him this week, play him next week, bench him the week after, and then play him from there on. Matthias Cunha's looked good to me. His minutes have just been increasing as he returns from injury, but on penalties, so essential to what Wolves have done, and no longer Morgan Rogers type of player where he's carrying a lot. He still does to an extent, but as a 9, he's definitely up there, and he's formed a nice partnership with Strand Larsen. We've seen that in the past that Aït-Nouri's got very good attacking output. He nearly got a goal against Forest. The rest of the team, I guess, isn't too different. I've got Gabriel instead of Robertson for the obvious reasons with the fixtures. I've got Fleck in there for the obvious reason, given I think that Brentford do concede a decent amount of shots. So even if they aren't to keep a clean sheet, say potential set, and when they do, high ceiling. I like Porro for his attacking threat and decent fixtures across the board. The other things to note is obviously I've got Mbeumo, and given this is a wildcard 6 draft, you can pretty much start him every week. I think the two really interesting picks, apart from the Wolves guys, are De Bruyne and Semenyo. Semenyo obviously is for 2 initial fixtures, Leicester and Southampton, and then you ship him off after. But De Bruyne is probably the one that I guess people weren't expecting. I think the City fixture run is magnificent. However, this selection is highly dependent on his expected minutes. However, he looked so good so far, and I think owners have been very unfortunate. There was a haul for him at West Ham. He hit the bar, he put in a lot of good balls. Even against Chelsea, he was good, and he could have got more against Ipswich. So those are probably the 2 picks that are slightly not as popular. People that I'm considering in this draft could definitely be someone like Jared Bowen, Eberechi Eze. I was quite close to getting Cole Palmer, and you could ignore the negative value in the bank because I can't afford this draft. I checked beforehand. So yeah, those are my thoughts. Not obviously 100 differences, given that wildcard 4 and wildcard 6 cannot be too different for strategic purposes. But what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I like it because obviously you start with triple Arsenal. Even let's say when we look at Porro, you're already skipping past the Arsenal fixture, already looking at to a generally good run of games, and he honestly still looks like incredible value this season. Like I'm still surprised by how attacking he looks this year. Like it feels like definitely a step up, and I know people like Baker talked about it in the preseason, but yeah, he's definitely one person I think I'll find it hard to get rid of my team currently. Semenyo I really like, and yeah, I think I'm with you in terms of I'm willing to change my mind on De Bruyne, particularly because of what we previously talked about too, with where we feel Foden is at within the team. That can change because obviously we know the abilities of Foden, but yeah, it's actually quite interesting. I'll definitely look forward to getting most of these players actually within my team in a few weeks' time. And I'd like to have a bit of Havertz because the reality I think so far is he just looks great. One pick I'd like to mention as well, because you have Cunha in the draft. I was also thinking about someone like Dominic Calvert-Lewin for people who might want to save some money. Just thinking ahead, actually Everton have a pretty good, decent run of games. Once again, it's going to be a question about, do we really think he's match fit? Because it's not something that has been consistent for the last 2 years. Are we going to buy into that Bournemouth performance where he drops 87 minutes, a goal and assist, and is that going to stay and remain the case? We'll see. But yeah, definitely interested in this draft.
Few talking points here. Let's talk about Dominic Solanke, because we've obviously talked about Porro, and you could see that combination popping up a lot. You could see goal Solanke, assist Porro on the official FPL Twitter. Is he someone you're considering? Because the fixtures are actually pretty good from an attacking standpoint, especially stylistically for Spurs. And an Ange number 9 is a totally different kettle of fish to most number 9s. I mean, the system's so optimized for them. Could we see a world where, if we assume that Haaland and Havertz are non-negotiable on wildcard 6, does he get the nod and you don't go for a cheap forward like Cunha or Joao Pedro?
I think the interesting thing here is you can kind of see Porro's fixtures, right, which are obviously the same as Solanke's, and I wonder if he's just the transfer from Havertz to Solanke. I'm still, I'm still really fully bought into the SAs and the Mbumos of the world. So
Yeah.
I can still see myself owning those players, but then definitely I think I would make room to go from Havertz to Solanke when the time comes at around Game Week 8.
Perfect. And then the last thing is, I've seen your initial strategy where you're definitely considering it. I've seen your recent tweet. Where are you right now with wildcarding in Game Week 6?
Yeah, I mean, right now we're sitting at an international break, so there's not really too many decisions to be made. Part of the reason why I'm a little bit colder on Game Week 6 wildcard is how good Haaland has looked. I think some of the value to what I thought maybe the Game Week 6 wildcard could have been would have been, getting a fully fit Foden in the team, getting Palmer, basically a full Nomium sort of squad with Saka inside, and then covering most of the captaincies outside of, let's say, 7 and 9, which I think are very prime Haaland captaincies. But honestly, with how good Haaland looks this season, I'm definitely a little bit colder on going Nomium. And I think that because the window looked really good for Nomium, I'm now looking ahead just to kind of keeping Haaland in my team. And I'm actually very happy with the team that I have right now, because if I was just to name some of the players that I already have, like I've got Haaland, I've got Saka, I've got Lewis, I've got Porro, I don't have Flecken, sadly, but I have someone like Rodgers, and I feel like I've got a pretty strong squad finally. Took 2 free transfers to get there, but I'm pretty happy with my team now, and I just wonder, if I prolong the wild card, is there going to be a situation down the line where I might need it more, as opposed to in a situation now where actually I'm pretty close to a draft like this, and I'm kind of comfortable maybe extending. What is nice is that since I'm rolling this week, we'll just get more information. Injuries could prop up, they might not, but then I'll also be able to determine specifically on Game Week 5, I think what direction I'm going to go, because we talked about it earlier in the pod. Salah is such a big captaincy there. You might even want to consider a Spurs pick because they've got Brentford at home Game Week 5. That's the kind of consideration that I want to make. And also Haaland versus Arsenal, which, as you said, City look very good from the attacking point of view. I feel like for the first time, they're just absolutely blowing teams away on attack. And, racking up 3xG per game. Now, that's not going to last forever, but we've never seen City start this hot in my recollection.
Yeah,
I think even Pep's mentioned how shocked he is at this, and I think he kind of likes it, because why wouldn't you want to have a good start to the season? So yeah, all those kind of things make me feel like I'm a little bit more up in air about the decision. And yeah, I guess Haaland has just been amazing.
So with this fixture swing, there's a lot of pressure currently on. I would say not pressure, but there's a lot of talk and momentum behind wildcard 4, wildcard 6. Something that I've almost committed to, still open-minded about, but committed to, and something that you're leading towards now is actually holding it for what could happen in the future, right? The fact that we haven't seen a high volume of injuries, the fact that we haven't had any Champions League games or any Carabao Cup games, I think a lot will change. For example, Liverpool, I think, is a side that will suffer as a result, right? Because their squad is not as deep as the likes of City's, especially in that pivot midfield area. Sure, they've got a lot of numbers in the front 3 who could essentially be called a front 5. But yeah, I mean, McAllister and Gravenberch, you've got some cover, but you don't have too much. And I think they could struggle with increased minutes just across the board. And that's why I quite like holding the wild card for a bit, just to see things unfold. And then as managers have said, as both Pep and Arteta have said, the real season almost starts now.
Yeah, I actually really like that thought, and I wasn't really thinking about it too much. But I mean, you look at someone like Harvey Elliott, who was considered a 10 within the preseason. He's been out in the cold completely. So yeah, how easy it is for Liverpool to suddenly integrate some of these players back in, and how big the drop off is going to be is something that I'll be keen to look forward to as well.
Yeah. All right. Well, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on. I've really enjoyed that, as per usual. Guys, make sure to go to subscribe to Fran. I say that, I almost forgot to say that because you probably already have done. Thank you very much for tuning in. Please do like the video if you enjoyed. Subscribe if you enjoyed. Much more content coming. I'm sure me and Fran will be back together on this channel relatively soon. Have a brilliant day, and I shall see you very soon. Goodbye.